Hello. Welcome to Democracy for Realists. Why Elections Do Not Produce Responsive Government by Achen and Bartels. Could be Bartels. And today it looks like we're going to finish Chapter 3, which is entitled Tumbling Down into a Democratical Republic, Pure Democracy and the Pitfalls of Popular Control. And so we are on this section called Citizen Competence and the Price of Popular Control. In the age of reform, Richard Hofstadter explicated the progressives' enthusiasm for the folk theory of democracy by describing the mythical man of goodwill at the core of their conception of politics. Quote, "It was assumed that somehow he would really be capable of informing himself in ample detail about the many issues that he would have to pass on, and that he could master their intricacies sufficiently to pass intelligent judgment. Without such assumptions, the entire movement for such reforms as the initiative, the referendum, and recall is unintelligible." End quote. As we saw in Chapter 2, contemporary political scientists have found little evidence of ordinary citizens mastering the intricacies of political issues. Nonetheless, some political scientists, at least, have expressed considerable confidence in the ability of ordinary citizens to exercise effective popular sovereignty via initiatives and referendums through the same sorts of heuristic processes we considered there. For example, Lupia and Matsusaka's literature review highlighted a, quote, frequent finding in new studies of direct democracy, that voters are competent to make the kinds of policy decisions with which direct democracy confronts them. End quote. Sometimes, of course, the issues underlying an initiative are simple or consensual, and the voters get it right. But can they do so when genuine policy complexities are involved? The primary empirical evidence cited in support of the optimistic view came from Lupia's own exit poll of 339 Los Angeles voters on a series of 5 1988 auto insurance initiatives. Lupia measured both detailed knowledge of the provisions of the various initiatives and knowledge of the insurance industry's position on each initiative. He found that, quote, respondents who possessed relatively low levels of factual or encyclopedic knowledge about the initiatives used their knowledge of insurance industry preferences to emulate the behavior of those respondents who had relatively high levels of factual knowledge. End quote. According to Lupia and Matsusaka, this finding, quote, demonstrated that voters can use simple pieces of information as substitutes for the detailed information that political surveys show them to lack. End quote. Alas, as James Kuklinski and Paul Quirk pointed out, quote, being relatively well-informed falls far short of being well-informed. End quote. Lupia's relatively well-informed voters overwhelmingly supported a proposal mandating a 20% rollback of auto insurance rates, a superficially appealing but short-sighted, and as it turned out, unworkable, attempt to repeal the law of supply and demand. Thus, quote, the evidence from the California referendum suggests that even relatively well-informed citizens responded heavily to extraneous factors, dislike of insurance companies, and wishful thinking about their rates, for example, rather than making an informed assessment of the merits, end quote, of the 5 proposals on the ballot. The only other empirical evidence cited in support of the claim that voters are competent to make the kinds of policy decisions with which direct democracy confronts them came from Sean Bowler and Todd Donovan's book, Demanding Choices, Opinion, Voting, and Direct Democracy. Lupia and Matsusaka quoted Bowler and Donovan's conclusion that, quote, voters appear able to figure out what they are for and against in ways that make sense in terms of their underlying values and interests. Just as legislators do, these voters make choices purposefully, using available information, end quote. In most domains, making choices on that basis would be considered a very low standard of competence. One would not want to engage a surgeon or fly with a pilot who proposed to make choices purposefully using available information. Indeed, Donovan and Bowler's evidence is by no means uniformly optimistic in its implications for the quality of policies adopted via direct democracy. For example, Broder cited Donovan and Bowler in support of the view that, quote, the tax limitation measures, like Proposal 13, that pass so readily when presented to the voters often have the perverse effect of reducing expenditures on popular public services, like parks and libraries, below what the public wants, end quote. Oddly, Lupia and Matsusaka's survey of the effects of direct democracy made no mention of California's Proposition 13, which set off a national tax revolt by sharply limiting and redistributing the state's property tax burden. In ignoring the single most consequential policy adopted by initiative in the modern era, Lupia and Matsusaka also overlooked the single most detailed empirical analysis of voters' decision-making under direct democracy. David Sears and Jack Citron's book-length study of Proposition 13 and related tax and spending issues. Sears and Critton found, quote, little evidence that voters reasoned very carefully from their basic preferences about taxation and spending and the effects they forecast of these tax reform measures to a vote decision, nor did the rationalizations for self-interest, however logically appropriate, always direct people to the equally appropriate vote decision. For example, it was not primarily the public employees' self-protectiveness toward their own wages that led them to oppose the tax revolt, nor did parents' preferences about school spending affect their votes on Proposition 13 any more strongly than non-parents' preferences affected theirs. Throughout our data, the voters seem to respond to symbols in an effectively consistent but not necessarily logical or reasoned way, end quote. Sears and Citron grappled with the apparent irrationality of voters wanting something for nothing, as the subtitle of their book put it. Quote, throughout most of the tax revolt period, the electorate wanted smaller government, but also the same or increased spending on specific services. But this combination quite clearly involves a logical tension, and there were no other benefits that we could add into that particular equation that would render that combination more sensible. We thought that perhaps voters believed services could be maintained, and government shrunk as well, if only waste were eliminated. Or perhaps the inconsistency held primarily among unsophisticated voters who might not realize the two goals were incompatible, or that voters equated big government with some especially unpopular services, such as welfare, and wanted to cut those but maintain others thought to be more essential, such as police and fire protection. Or perhaps voters were indulging a wish-fulfilling mood when responding to surveys and only confront the hard trade-offs between taxes and services when faced with them explicitly at the ballot box. But none of these escape routes succeeded in explaining away this basic anomaly. It prevailed even among people believing in small amounts of waste, the most sophisticated voters, and both liberals and conservatives." End quote. When voters insist on getting something for nothing, the cost is likely to be higher than they realize. One striking example of perverse consequences comes from an unusually careful empirical study of the impact of direct democracy on the actual quality of government services. Jeff Tessen's analysis of fire protection services in Illinois. In the early 1990s, some counties in Illinois began requiring local governments to obtain voter approval for increases in property tax levies exceeding the rate of inflation. The referendum requirement was instituted in 5 suburban counties bordering Chicago in 1991, in Cook County, including Chicago, in 1994, and on the basis of county-wide referendums initiated by county boards, in 34 downstate counties over the subsequent 13 years. Tessen exploited both geographical and temporal variation in this institutional requirement to examine the impact of tax referendums on the quality of fire protection services provided by Illinois fire districts, special districts akin to school districts that operate largely independent of county governments. As Tessen noted, there is relatively little political disagreement regarding the desirability of high-quality fire protection, and a good deal of consensus among experts about how to measure the quality of fire services in practice. Moreover, local idiosyncrasies in proposing and adopting referendum requirements meant that affected and unaffected downstate fire districts were similar in many key respects. Tessen excluded Chicago districts from his analysis due to lack of a comparable area with different laws. Thus, this seemingly narrow case allows for an unusually compelling empirical assessment of the impact of popular control on the quality of an important public service. As might be expected, based on Matsusaka's findings, Tessen found that fire districts affected by the referendum requirement experienced slower growth in tax revenues. With a variety of potentially important demographic and political characteristics statistically controlled, Tessen found that districts with referendum requirements experienced average annual revenue growth of 3.9%, as compared with 6.2% in districts without referendum requirements. As a result, the typical household's property tax bill increased by 43 cents less per year in districts with referendum requirements, $1.07 versus $1.50. What would those additional 43 cents annually have bought? According to a retired fire chief interviewed by Tessen, the referendum requirement significantly constrained the resources of affected fire districts, causing them to reduce training and defer maintenance and replacement of capital equipment. The result was a measurable degradation in the quality of fire protection services. Using data recorded in the National Fire Incident Reporting System, Tessen showed that the average response time across all Illinois fire districts during the period covered by his analysis was 11.5 minutes, far above the widely accepted 4 to 5 minute adequate response standard. But in fire districts with referendum requirements, average response times were almost 1 minute, about 7% higher than in comparable districts without referendum requirements. He noted that this difference is substantively large based on widely accepted fire safety standards and represents a serious decline in public safety. Moreover, the impact of the referendum requirement on average response times appeared to increase the longer the requirement was in force, from about 45 seconds in the first 4 years following implementation of the referendum requirement to 80 seconds thereafter, presumably reflecting the cumulative effect on training and equipment maintenance and replacement of smaller tax increases over several years. Tessin considered the possibility that, quote, voters rationally traded lower taxes for higher response times, end quote. However, he noted that, quote, most citizens want to maintain or improve fire services even when survey questions draw attention to the trade-off between services and spending, and that, in any case, the tax savings that voters enjoyed may have been smaller than what they would have saved on their homeowners' insurance policies with better fire protection. End quote. Thus, he concluded that, quote, given more power over policy inputs, voters produced worse outcomes than those produced by the counterfactual institutions in which public officials had more independence from public opinion, end quote. The risks of inadequate fire protection were seen in graphic form during the 1991 Oakland Hills firestorm in California. This terrifying fire destroyed more than 3,000 homes, killed 25 people, and seriously injured more than 150 others during a 24-hour period. According to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, long-standing drought conditions and high winds made the firefighting difficult, but the 1978 passage of the Proposition 13 tax-cutting initiative exacerbated the difficulties. The proposition eliminated a number of firefighting companies and reduced the staffing of those that remained. Funds for removal of dead trees were also cut drastically. When the fire began, the result was an uncontrollable conflagration for many hours, although detailed voting data for the fire-stricken area itself seemed to be unavailable. The sad irony is that the victims had probably voted heavily for Proposition 13. The Piedmont area of Oakland, at the edge of the fire, had voted 73% in favor. Direct democracy had overruled the judgment of fire professionals with horrific results. Of course, most results of direct democracy are less dire. Tessin found cases in which provisions increasing direct public control of policy produced no discernible decline in the quality of government services. For example, laws requiring voter approval of bonds to pay for sewers and prisons had no apparent ill effects on the frequency of sewer overflows or prison overcrowding. Yet even this seemingly good news for the folk theory turned out to be illusory. The voters continued their self-defeating votes in these elections, but they were saved by public officials who quietly created workarounds to keep the voters from harming themselves using a variety of tools such as user fees and unguaranteed bonds to adopt their preferred policies over the median voter's objection. However, quote, the elite discretion needed to maintain performance is not always cost-free, because unguaranteed bonds typically have higher transaction costs due to higher interest rates and the need for more services from banks and bond lawyers. Voters pay a price for a largely symbolic form of popular control. The quality of prisons and sewers are no different under direct and representative democracy, but public officials must spend significant time, effort, and tax dollars to compensate for voter-imposed spending cuts, end quote. Whereas Tessin's analysis focused on the impact of more direct public control on government spending and performance, Michael Santz's analysis of property tax assessments in New York towns focused on the impact of electoral accountability on the equity and efficiency of government's tax policies. Gradually, over a 25 period, hundreds of New York towns switched from electing to appointing their property assessors. Comparing assessments in the same towns before and after the switch, allowing for persistent differences across towns and statewide fluctuations from year to year, census found that direct election of assessors reduced the probability of conducting an assessment in any given year by 9 percentage points, increasing the average time between reassessments from about 5 years to 9 years. The main effect of less frequent assessments was to benefit affluent homeowners at the expense of others. Census estimated that directly electing assessors increased the average advantage in effective tax rates for the most expensive homes, relative to the least expensive homes, by 26 percentage points. In this instance, greater electoral accountability mostly seems to have involved catering to the interests of an affluent and probably more attentive minority of the electorate. The lesson we draw from these studies is not that some direct popular control of policymaking is always undesirable. Rather, it is often costly, sometimes frighteningly costly, and a political culture that uncritically equates good government with more democracy will be ill-equipped to sensibly weigh the benefits of greater popular control against the costs. Conclusion. One moment. Sorry. As a blueprint for government, the folk theory is hopelessly flawed. Primaries and referendums with no admixture of party or legislative influence exemplify the failure. Overlooking the elemental necessity for organized leadership in a democratic politics has produced a mishmash of heightened responsiveness to popular impulses, behind-the-scenes elite influence, and self-defeating choices stemming from the limited political expertise and attention of ordinary citizens. Something different is needed to break the cycle of blind, plebiscitary reforms and ensuing political dysfunction. That is not to suggest that every aspect of American politics has been sufficiently democratized. For example, we suspect that American government would function better if the poor were better organized and more economically secure, if turnout in elections were higher and more equal, and if campaigns were financed with public funds rather than with contributions from billionaires, ideologues, and special interest groups. In Keynes' terms, these are instances in which populist and pluralist reform impulses point in the same direction. But contemporary thinking about democracy is too often simplistic in its understanding of the role of the public in the democratic process. In consequence, it provides little help in creating political institutions that would make ordinary people's interests more effective in government decision-making. As we have emphasized, the founders believed that popular preferences needed to be tempered by political experience and judgment. That is, they believed in both political leadership and popular influence. Neither would be right all the time, but balance would help correct the flaws of each. Thus, they opposed both kingship and majoritarianism. Nowadays, we often cloak our political practices in the founders' authority while downplaying or even rejecting the importance of leadership in their political thinking. In this regard, Charles Beard did us a great favor. By reminding us of the wealth and conservation of the founders, Beard's classic Economic Interpretation of the Constitution, 1913, made the tensions between contemporary thinking about popular rule and the logic of the revered Constitution psychologically manageable. The Republican principles of the founders are now conveniently dismissed as the elitist and aristocratic trappings of a bygone era. Hence, coping with the deep differences between their sophisticated ideas and our simplicities, which would not be easy, becomes happily unnecessary. This conceptual laziness has consequences. Faced with the inevitable occasional failures of our political institutions, we cast about for curative measures. But we have only one cure we trust. Throughout American history, calls for political reform have nearly always entailed calls for greater democratization. But the medicine has rarely been applied thoughtfully. It is as if we prescribed powerful antibiotics for every illness. Sometimes they have cured, sometimes they have been a harmless waste, and sometimes they have caused organ damage, seizures, or psychosis. In their influential early study of primary elections, Charles Merriam and Louis Overacker alluded to criticisms of the then still new mode of popular participation in the nominating process. Quote, "Most of the objections raised against primaries," they wrote in the conclusion of their book, "apply to elections as well as to universal suffrage and to the whole plan of democracy. Disbelievers in popular government are constantly asserting that many are incompetent, that many are indifferent, that many are lax, lazy, and drifting, that nothing can come from this mediocre mass of yokels and boobs, that the mass should abdicate in favor of the few and kiss the rod that condescends to rule them, thanking God that they are allowed to live and be cared for by their betters. These are common charges among those to whom modern democracy is unwelcome." End quote. Merriam and Overacker's shrill dismissal of the critics of primary elections betrays a moral certitude regarding the nature and value of modern democracy that is perhaps even more common now than it was when they wrote, in the immediate wake of the progressive era. Now as then, standing up for popular government in opposition to the few conveys an immediate and more or less automatic rhetorical advantage. Even writers whose professional expertise will not let them pretend that people are attentive or well-informed find it helpful to wrap themselves in the flag in their uplifting conclusions. We have argued in this chapter for a quite different understanding of American democratic history, one in which simplistic faith in popular government has often outpaced its usefulness as a practical mechanism for policy making. In America, as elsewhere, the movement toward greater power for ordinary citizens began as an overdue corrective against centuries of domination by military, economic, religious, and cultural elites. For centuries, more democracy was a good idea as well as an appealing ideal, but nothing that simple is a defensible all-purpose theory of government. In time, democratization cured many of the evils that had initially animated the demand for popular control. Despotic governments, corrupt aristocracies, and restrictions on suffrage were swept away. But because popular understandings of democracy provided no clear recipe for reconciling popular control with competent leadership, the cure of more democracy went on being applied in every crisis. The adoption and expansion of direct primaries, initiatives, and referendums demonstrate the influence of this view on American political thought and practice in the progressive era and since. On this populist view, representative institutions are, at best, unfortunate substitutes for direct democracy, necessitated by the inconvenience and expense of frequent plebiscites. When we must have representation, the representative should be an instructed delegate, someone who goes off to the legislature to mechanically vote for the preferences of her district as recorded in opinion polls. However, modern technology is swiftly reducing the inconvenience and expense of frequent plebiscites in a way that even the progressives could not have imagined. Recently, a congressional staffer turned technology entrepreneur launched Capitol Bells a smartphone application that lets constituents vote in real time on bills being considered on the House floor. According to one enthusiastic commentator, it's like the holy grail of civic engagement, letting Americans participate in the process of legislating. Eventually, the developer promised, quote, lawmakers will be able to gauge how well they are representing their most engaged constituents by looking at differences in the last 20 or 30 votes, end quote. We see little reason to think that letting lawmakers' most engaged constituents participate in the process of legislating every time their phones chime would improve either the process of legislating or the product. Edmund Burke and James Madison, among many others, favor a very different model of representation, the trustee model. On this view, elected officials ought to use their own judgment to look out for the best interests of their district and their country, regardless of what their constituents believe. But this perspective flies in the face of the simplistic enthusiasm for more democracy in modern American political culture. As the majority of respondents in one recent survey had it, the will of the people on most issues is pretty clear, and politicians should just follow it. In the wake of Warren Miller and Donald Stokes' landmark study of constituency influence in Congress, political scientists too have largely taken to studying political representation by measuring the fidelity with which elected representatives just follow the preferences of their constituents, whether on broad issue dimensions of the sort analyzed by Miller and Stokes, or specific roll call votes or overall liberal conservative ideology. Even when subsequent scholars have not explicitly endorsed the instructed delegate model of representation, they have often implicitly accepted it as the appropriate benchmark for empirical analysis, as noted by Achen, who ended up by accepting it himself. The influence of the trustee model has declined substantially by comparison, due in no small part to the fact that judgment and best interests are much harder to measure than the constituency preferences reflected in opinion polls. Alas, as we saw in Chapter 2, empirical studies of representation grounded in the instructed delegate model have produced very mixed results. The positions of elected officials are usually no more than mildly correlated with those of their constituents. Apparent disparities are persistent and sometimes substantial, notwithstanding the pressures toward congruence arising from electoral competition. Whether those disparities are attributable to or plausibly justifiable in terms of a trustee model of representation is, for now, simply unknown. Faced with that fact, and with an eye toward the manifest failures of the folk theory, many political scientists have devoted increasing attention to a different conception of the meaning of elections, closer in spirit to the trustee model. In this alternative conception, the point of elections is not to mimic the policy outcomes of direct democracy by constraining elected officials to pursue the policy preferences of their constituents. Ordinary citizens have too little free time for political study and thought to make that theory work well. Rather, elections are seen as a mechanism by which voters can hold elected officials accountable, after the fact, for the success or failure of whatever policies they choose to pursue. This alternative view, which we set out in Chapter 4, has seemed to many scholars to offer a more tenable and appealing model of democracy than the folk theory. In Chapters 5, 6, and 7, we assess how well this alternative model of democracy works in practice. That is the end of the chapter. Chapter 4 is next. It is called A Rational God of Vengeance and of Reward, the Logic of Retrospective Accountability. Yeah, that's it for Chapter 3.